To celebrate the launch month of my new book, The Permaculture Garden, here is a compilation of some incredible permaculture gardens that I visited and filmed for my Inspiring Garden series.
A lot of people say I don't have room for a fruit tree, I don't have room to grow vegetables, but I think you can do all those things in even the smallest spaces. It's just coming up with the right design, thinking about how you do it and fitting it all in really. And we've got 20 odd types of fruit growing in here and probably over 20 types of vegetable, chickens and ducks, and all in an 80-foot by 40-foot rectangle behind a very ordinary house. Hi, I'm Wade Muggleton and welcome to our permaculture garden here in Shropshire. I'm a very keen gardener, author, writer and very keen permaculture and grow your owner. So we moved to this garden in 2002 and it was pretty much a blank canvas. It's basically a rectangle behind an ex-council house, so it's very representative of what I call a very ordinary plot. There must be thousands of similar plots in the country, and hopefully it shows what you can do with a small plot. We didn't really practice the classic permaculture design of like sitting down and drawing it all out and thinking about it, because it was the first house we'd ever owned. We were kind of quite excited and really keen to get on with it. So, but it does fall roughly into three zones. We've got the lower third is where the chickens and the ducks and the big fruit trees are. The middle zone is the vegetable garden with some dwarfing fruit trees, and the zone nearest the house is lawn, herb bed, fish pond, where the guinea pigs go. So it kind of falls roughly into sort of three zones as you go down the garden. It's very, very heavy clay here in Shropshire, so I would never entertain digging it. So I'm a big fan of no dig, so we literally put the raised beds on top of the lawn, sheet mulched them out with cardboard and compost and soil in on the top, and that was 20 years ago and they've never been dug since. And I'd like to think they're pretty good well off for that really. Well, I grew up in Somerset, which I suppose is a famous apple county, certainly with its cider orchards, and I've just always been really interested in sort of varieties and trees, and it sort of all comes together really in terms of there are all these amazing array of historic apples. Most people only ever see the 4 or 5 in the supermarket, whereas there's over 2,000, well over 2,000 named British varieties. And lots of them are unique to a certain village or district or county. So I think there's a wealth of living history really in growing heritage varieties. I think having animals in the garden just makes the place more interesting anyway. We've kept chickens for years. Obviously you get eggs, you also get additions to the compost heap when you clean them out. The ducks, I've got muscovies, the sort of classic permaculture duck. I like them. I think they're just nice animals to have around. They don't lay a lot of eggs, to be honest, but they do a bit of slugging. In the winter, I let them in the vegetable garden, complete free range to hopefully clear up a lot of pest problems. And I think they're just nice things to have around, really. So we've kept ducks in 2 or 3 different phases, but we've always had chickens as well. Animals just add another dimension to the garden in terms of fertility, interest, pest control. So it has been a very, very dry year. We try to sort of harvest water in the garden, offer every opportunity we can. We've got 6 water butts and we've got a slightly unusual system of using an old underground septic tank that's now derelict. So we pipe water off the roofs into this tank all winter underground, and then with a pump we can draw it back out. So I haven't used a hose or a tap this year in the garden. And we also mulch. Mulch is just massively beneficial at keeping the moisture in, reducing the weeds, and ultimately as it rots down it feeds the plants as well. I tend to use wood chip, but I'll just chip anything really that we've got or compost it. I like to think that nothing ever gets thrown out. We don't really use our council green bin because that's a waste of resource leaving the property when you could use it on site. I think if you can make your garden like a sponge so that when it does rain it all gets taken up. We've got a swale in one part, we've got lots of wood chip paths, wood chip mulches, straw mulches, and all the water harvesting. So I'd like to think that most of the water that falls on this garden remains within the garden. It doesn't run off and flood anywhere else. Here I tend to sow most things into modules and start them off because it is heavy clay. There is a bit of a slug problem. So if you put tiny things out, they get hammered. I think if you get them to a certain size before they go out. We're also 600 feet here up in the Shropshire Hills, so the season comes a bit later. It can be still quite chilly in March, April, even sometimes into early May. So by using the 2 greenhouses as the sort of engine room of the garden, we get lots of things going. So if you came here in spring, it is chocker with the greenhouses, with things waiting to go outside when the weather is right. But yeah, direct sowing can be problematic with slugs, so I'm a big fan of giving them a head start. Yeah, I think when I started, I probably was if you can't eat it, we don't grow it sort of approach. But I have mellowed massively in terms of pollinators and wildlife and insects, and thinking the value of having all these other creatures in the garden. It's amazing for bumblebees, honeybees, hoverflies. And a lot of those things are an important element in the biodiversity of the garden. So they're keeping pests under control, they're pollinating crops. So yeah, I definitely have a lot of flowers now for the wildlife and for the pollinators. We have had reasonable sweet corn crops here. As I say, we are at 600 feet. It is a bit exposed, but they're probably going to be a bit small this year because of the dry weather. But we usually get a crop, and there's nothing like picking them, taking them inside and eating them within 20 minutes of them being on the plant. You'll never replicate that with a bought one that's been off the plant for several days. The thing with growing crops of any sort in gardening is that in any year you will have some things will have a good year and some things will not have such a good year. This year the potatoes have been the best ever. The tomato crop looks really impressive, but the beans and the brassicas haven't been so good. In other years, other things have better years. So I think that's why diversity is king. If you grow lots and lots of different things, you will always get a harvest. I think raised beds are great because it takes the digging and the hard work and the sort of unpleasant element out of gardening. So I'm a massive fan of no-dig raised beds. They also break the garden into manageable chunks. And when it comes to growing, it's like grow what you like. I think there's sometimes a sort of an idea that the old boys on the allotments that thou shalt grow sprouts, potatoes, carrots and onions. But personally, I dislike sprouts intensely, so I don't grow sprouts. But it's like grow what you like. I love picking my own tomatoes. I think that is probably the highlight of the gardening year, is when you pick your own tomatoes and eat them when they're still warm. And people say it's not worth growing potatoes because they're cheap, but I love unearthing your own potatoes. Commercial potato growing is quite environmentally damaging. Lots of soil ends up in the rivers and things. So growing potatoes is really environmental. Yeah, I think when it comes to potatoes, Charlotte is the go-to variety for us. They've just been superb this year. And as an early sort of salad or just generally early potato, they are absolutely fantastic. They were as clean as a whistle this year, no slug damage at all. And yet when it comes to apples, this is May Queen, one of my favourites. It's an old variety from Worcester, 1870s, but it's a fantastic variety. This tree is 18 years old. It's cropped every year since it was 2. It's on an M26 rootstock, so it's not too big. It doesn't dominate the vegetable garden, so it's the right tree in the right place. M26 is, in my opinion, the best rootstock for the smaller garden. I think if you go too small, M9, M27, they're just naturally a bit weedy anyway, but M26 has got enough vigour to give you a decent tree, but it won't get enormous. My book, the Orchard book, came out earlier this year, and I tried to distill 20 years of messing about with orchards and fruit trees and things into a book. So that was my lockdown project, really, was to try and capture it all in a book. Yeah, I mean, we've got 30 odd varieties of apple here in the garden, and I've got another 75 at my orchard up the road. So I've got about 105 varieties altogether. We do end up with a huge amount of apples, but we make juice out of most of them. So we have a village press, and I've got a little pasteurizer. So we make maybe 120 bottles of apple juice a year, put them in a cupboard in the shed. As a result of that, we hardly ever buy orange juice anymore. I did manage to sell a few boxes to a cider maker one year. So yeah, I absolutely try and utilise as many as possible, but equally I'm not averse to leaving a few on the floor for the wildlife. When the winter comes, the field fares and the redwings come in and feed on them, and it's a great sight. So always leave a bit for nature. Permaculture to me, I suppose, is sustainability. It's about trying to tread more lightly upon the earth, leave it in a better condition for our kids. So yeah, to me that's what it's about. And I always say that when you're growing your own, everything you grow yourself doesn't have to come from somewhere else, because it's the coming from somewhere else that is the problem. That's where the transport, the pollution, the packaging, the waste all occurs. So if you walk out the door and pick an apple off your own tree, as opposed to buying one that's come from New Zealand, there's obviously a big carbon footprint and energy difference. So we've had a lot of people visit the garden over the years as a permaculture demonstration site, and through the National Open Garden Scheme, where the village open gardens, and ours is one of those that's open. But people often say to me, they come up to me and they say, it's lovely, but it must be such a lot of work, in a slightly condescending. And I that really winds me up, because I think it's not work. I never once think of it as work, because I enjoy doing it. I would much rather be out here than I would sat in front of the TV. So I think perceptions of work is a funny one. People often think of it as a negative thing, whereas good work is a great thing, I think, for well-being and positivity and activity and fitness and everything. So gardening, as a friend of mine said, gardening is good for the soul, and I think that's right. Enjoy it. You know, it is a wonderful thing because it is fresh air, exercise, well-being, being outdoors. What could be better? It's not work.
So we're here at Glasbren. Glasbren means sapling in Welsh, and we're a community-based social enterprise based here at my family farm, Bronhael Farm, in West Wales near Carmarthen. And Steph and I together run a 1 acre no-dig agroecological market garden, and we feed 50 households-ish between the rivers Tav in the west and Towy in the east every week with a box of freshly harvested and cut vegetables and fruits and herbs. This was kind of the logical continuation of the home garden that was already here, kind of above the polytunnel here. That was the original farm vegetable garden. So I just kind of continued from there, but this land looked very much like this pasture we have over here, kind of heavily grazed, and because of the nature of the land, it was sloping in both directions, and it's got heavy clay soil, and a lot of the good soil from the top had kind of made its way down to the bottom of the hills. So yeah, it sort of presented a lot of interesting design challenges and how to make best use of what is essentially marginal land, you know, and how to turn that into a kind of multi-tiered, productive, flourishing market garden, basically. A couple of years ago, when we had that big dry spell in the summer, we were really caught out by a lack of water. Basically, we're on a well here, so the well got really low, and we suddenly found ourselves in quite an emergency situation trying to keep the crops alive. So over the last couple of years, we've been thinking a lot about how we can harness, you know, the heaps of rainwater that we get here in Wales when we do have it, and store it up in the garden. So one of those ways is that we've got a system of IBCs. These are just second-hand IBCs that you can pick up. They're 1,000 litres each, and we catch rainwater off the packing shed up the top of the hill, and using the natural hillside, the natural fall of the land, we use gravity to just transport that water from IBC to IBC at different stages through the garden, so that we have water accessible and available at different points where we need it. We still mostly water by hand, which is kind of a choice that we've made. For us, it's a way of kind of keeping a watch over the whole garden. It's a way of kind of, it's almost like a ceremonial thing. It's a way of us kind of feeding the plants and giving back what we take out. And so to do that, we also have these blue barrels, also second-hand from agricultural waste, that we run the water into those, so that it's really easy to just dunk a watering can in and fill it with water, and then away you go. And so yeah, it's just more and more. We've got about, I think, 6,000 or 7,000 litres stored in the garden right now, and the polytunnels also run exclusively on rainwater, and we want to have more and more, really, so that we really feel like if another drought came, if we had 6 weeks or 2 months without rainwater, we could survive. My background really was from permaculture. You know, I'm trained through the permaculture way of doing things, which is has had to be adapted definitely for this context, for a more productive market garden context, and bringing in some other schools of thought as well. But ultimately, at the heart, at the core of this is the ideas around permaculture. So yeah, observation, interaction, working with what you have, and working with nature, letting the way the forest grows be the guide, really.
So one of our passions here at Glasbren is keeping a variety of plants in amongst the vegetables and a lot of flowers, because not only do we use them for our bunches for our boxes, but they're good for the insects, good for biodiversity, and then also it makes it look beautiful. So dotted around the farm, we've got a lot of perennials like this sea buckthorn. Now the good thing about this plant is that it's a nitrogen fixer, and it also produces these delicious, nutritious berries. The reason we've got a lot of perennials around the vegetables is so that the root systems keep this great mycelium network for nutrients and water, and it replicates what's there in the wild. So we're growing our veg, copying what's out there in the wild.
The thing that led me into doing this was kind of thinking about bigger issues in relation to the environment, climate change, biodiversity loss, and looking at why, you know, what are the core reasons behind that. And I think for me it was all about a profound disconnection from the natural world, and so for myself and in the work that we do, I wanted to do something that would bring myself back into a deep relationship with the natural world. And I think food growing and the kind of traditional life ways that are involved in it, and the way people have lived on land for forever. Seemed like a really simple way we could all start to reconnect with our local land and with our seed and with our foods, and and start to feel that kind of love and appreciation for the natural world that supports us and feeds us, and a way that everybody can kind of get into that together, you know. And so I started to see kind of how food growing in my own life could be my way of deepening my relationship with the natural world, but also how we could bring people onto the land and start to offer that to other people, and offer it through the boxes as well, you know, the opportunity to eat with the seasons and have a connection with your local farmers and have a connection with your local soil, and do something that was regenerative in the local area, basically.
So we enjoy being more intuitive with our gardening here, which means we really get to understand what our soil health is and what plants work well with each other. And so sometimes we get a bit more experimental with things. So here we've got some beetroot growing with some sweet corn, and it turned out really well. Also, what we like to do is we like to keep some of our plants going to seed. So this coriander here, not only is a good pollinator, but also is going to produce some amazing seeds for us, which we can save for next year.
Yeah, so I think the main thing I've probably learned is the power of growing food together. It's like how much of a different experience farming and growing food can be if you do it with other people, if you come to rely on each other, if you come to support each other, and just how much of a different lifestyle it can be, and how much healthier it can be, and how much more fun and vibrant it can be. And just having time, you know, time to live and time to enjoy and time to feel in connection to this place, instead of just kind of in a productivity mindset, you know, just trying to produce as much veg, you know, looking at the bottom line, but actually enjoying the experience of doing it and actually feeling like I'm in relationship with this place and I'm learning from it and it's teaching me. And I suppose the important point is that I came up from being a home grower, and I just scaled up what I was doing as a home grower, essentially with some tweaks and tricks and things I learned from other market gardeners. But yeah. Here at the garden we don't dig, we don't till, we don't turn the soil in any way. We operate on a no-dig system, so we have all these series of permanent raised beds, basically, where we grow the food with wood chip paths in between. And the reason for that is no-dig is much better for the soil, much better for the soil structure, keeping that structure in place, keeping all the life and microorganisms in place, and just adding a fresh layer of organic matter after every crop, much like the forest, the way that the forest makes soil. And yeah, it's really helping us in the way that it's much easier, it's a lot less work, it's much better for weed pressure, we have a lot less weeds, and much better for water retention. And also in terms of harvesting veg for the veg boxes, we're finding the veg comes off a lot cleaner as well, you know, we're not having to wash the crops.
So the great thing about compost heaps is that you can use whatever you've got around on the farm or on your own land. What we like to do is we like to use some manure, some old crops that have gone to seed, some comfrey, and then some like kitchen household waste, which we've got here. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to add some manure onto this to add the bacteria into the compost heap. And the key thing is to make it all into layers, because we want to get as much heat as possible for it to break down. So I've got some manure on there now. I'm going to add some of the comfrey that we picked earlier. And we're lucky enough to have a lot of wood chip on this farm. And wood chip on its own is quite acidic for the ground. So what we like to do is we like to leave it for about 6 months, and then it breaks down, and then we add it to the compost heap. So the idea of this is we're going to layer it up, and there's going to be a variety of different things in there. There's going to be some green stuff, some brown, some wood chip, and then in about a month's time you can have this beautiful, delicious compost that we can use. So what we have here is a compost heap that we made about a month ago, and it's gone through different stages of heat temperatures to really rot down everything inside. And I've got my trusted thermometer here, which I use on a regular basis for my compost heaps. I just put it in there, and this is going to show about 35 to 40 degrees, and it's really nice warm to the touch. But but you want to get it to around 60 degrees a few times to get it really rotting down. Now this here is a mixture of those layers from before, and all the greenery has just has gone really, and it's just this delicious compost that we can use straight away now onto the ground.
So yeah, here we are in the seed house, the tihadai. This is where all our propagation and seed saving and seed drying happens. And seeds are really important to us here because, as you know, it's really the bedrock of the whole operation. It's where our food comes from. And I'm particularly interested in kind of the stories in seed and the people that have saved seeds in the past and have passed it on, and kind of protecting that kind of genetic diversity and protecting the stories and protecting the history embedded in the seed, and making sure that we use only open pollinated seeds, so seeds pollinated by bees and other insects, organic seeds sourced locally, to try and kind of do a little sort of small pushback against the power of the major seed companies and corporations trying to reduce seed to just a handful of varieties. We've started a seed circle recently locally with a bunch of us, so we're now hopefully working to a point where together we can save the whole spectrum of seeds without having to do them all ourselves, which makes it a bit easier in terms of isolation and just sharing the load really. So I think people can put up barriers and limitations to them being able to get into fruit growing, or kind of become a bit fixed on the proper way to do things, and I think, yeah, one of the core takeaways for me from doing this in a more kind of intuitive, instinctual way, is that if you grow food, if you make the focus of your growing food being in relationship with the garden and observing and interacting and really just letting the garden teach you, then I think there doesn't need to be any limits, and there's no doing things wrong, because things are going to go well and things are going to go not so well, and I think you just have to, as part of accepting the reality of food growing, it's part of living with the seasons, with the changing nature of the Welsh climate here, and almost like surrendering really to something that we can't control ultimately. We're not in control. We can just try our best to understand and have a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of background to help us have the best chance of having a good crop out of the garden, but ultimately there are other forces at work.
Hello, I'm Llyr. I'm from Midwest Wales and I'm 15. I've got two main growing areas, the food forest and the veg garden, and I also keep a herd of dairy goats. Well, I took cuttings of a blackcurrant bush a couple of years ago and put them in a bucket of water, and they rooted a few months, and I just caught the bug then. So in 2017, my grandfather put these apple trees in. And then last year in lockdown, I came through with a strimmer, trimmed it all and started managing it a bit better. And then in the autumn and winter last year and early this year, I laid cardboard down like Charles Dowding and put this mulch over the top, which is old horse bedding. Did sort of a food forest out of it. And then I planted the raspberry canes. I made the no-dig bed, planted up the pear tree, the herb bed in the back, and I also did some loganberries and tayberries in other places of the garden as well. Upcycling is quite important to me because I'd rather use something than discard it. So like the front of the compost bin there is the old gate from by the house. A lot of the pallets are from a local farmer's merchant. The raised beds are all made out of second-hand planks that we've got from around the farm. And I've also planted up an old bath here with the potatoes followed by spring cabbages. I enjoy no-dig because it's easy, but it's got its pros and cons like everything. So like if you were to dig, you could just incorporate fresh muck and then leave it over winter, and then that's plantable next spring. Whereas like if you're going no-dig, you've got to have like a sowable or plantable medium to put down in the first place. All my ideas come from 4 books: The Herb and Vegetable Expert, the RHS Complete Growing Guide, Hugh Richards' Grow Food for Free, and the Veg in One Bed book. One of the things that might inspire people as well is I did a hinged raised polytunnel out of old bits of alcathene, a guttering pipe, some old battens and some old planks. Then I bought polytunnel plastic and made that all on my own, and just, if you set your goal on something, just go for it. There's no harm in trying. James Prigioni inspired me to do that, and same with this food forest really. He inspired me with the mulch and the growing amongst the trees and stuff sort of style. Sometimes just because there's a tree there doesn't mean that you can't pop something underneath it and still benefit from the land. Here in particular, slug damage is quite high because I've laid the cardboard down and they're hiding under the cardboard at the moment, but I'm hoping that'll only be year one. I also like to do feeding stations with an organic slug pellets. So I put it over in the grass and then they'll go away, so it's not actually in the growing area, it's not in contact with food, it's drawing them out as well. Next year I want to completely mulch all of the grass around the tyres, all down the banks here, all tight up to the fence, because I've heard a saying that it takes 4 years to build a fully functioning garden, and it'll be year 3 next year, so I need to pull my socks up. So another way to increase your growing space is, if you've got a slope, you could do it like a terraced raised bed. So I made mine out of second-hand planks. I looked at a few YouTube videos, found a few, and then I just went at it, building it in the shed on a Friday night. It shows that just because it's a slope doesn't mean it's wasted ground. You could always grow something there and benefit from it. This time last year, this whole area was about 4 foot of brambles, ragwort, docks, ivy. We brought a digger through to pull out all the ivy roots and the ragwort roots and all that. And then I've been working at it since March to get it to a point where we can grow in it. I think the biggest challenge is working out spacings and stuff, because there's not many straight lines, so spacings on a curve can be quite a challenge, but also just weeding in general, but that'll come with time. What makes me want to grow this amount of food is the fact that, well, I want to be as self-sufficient as possible. So by growing large quantities of food like this, we can cut down the food bill, saving a bit of money, but then that money, we can put some of it back into the veg. It's like a cycle, if you like, of self-sufficiency. I come home from school every day, then I feed the goats and have a bite to eat. So that takes me till about 5 o'clock. And then from 5 till 7, I'll work my socks off in the garden, planting, spreading muck, sowing seeds. After supper then, about half past 7, I'll come back out and work for another hour until it goes dark. So in the summer, I might be out here till 10 o'clock at night. And then I'll go in and just sit and read a book, or at the moment, it's the Mr. Fothergill seed catalogue. Next year, I won't be doing so many cabbages, because the cabbage white butterfly is quite bad in this area, especially. But also, all this area from here down next year will be carrots and beetroot, because they are our staple crops. I think my biggest surprise this year has got to be these beetroot. So they were all multi-sown as 3 to 4 in the clump. Everybody was telling me, experienced gardeners of 40, 50 years have been telling me, oh, it won't work, it won't work. And I managed to do it and proved them all wrong. It's just nice to see something work after all these months of waiting. There's 2 tips, really. One is, I'd probably go no dig if you haven't got much time on your hands, or if you've got the resources to start off. But second tip that I like going off quite often is go big or go home. I've just gone all out, full hog. I wouldn't say work too hard, but get the job done. Sometimes it could be a bit of a drag weeding docks that you've already pulled, and then the odd root comes back, but they'll go eventually. And With the cabbages, they look after themselves. I don't bother weeding around them because they're so big. They are the main competitors for light. The undercover growing space is a must for any gardener, I think. It's really important to me because it means I can start crops earlier, finish crops later, and start them later again. But most importantly, I can grow tomatoes and cucumbers that you could grow outside, but I don't think they'd last as long with the blight, and we don't really have the weather conditions in the United Kingdom. So having an undercover growing space opens the doors to another lot of plants, if you like. If you haven't tried cucamelons, I highly recommend you do, because you can grow them really close together. Mine are only about 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres apart, and I've got 20 in a row. They're really tasty. They taste like a cucumber with like a lemony lime kick. But one thing I have heard people say is you can grow them up your tomato plants because it saves space. Just put one at the base of every tomato plant. But they're really good to pickle. They're really good in salads. And I mean, some of them don't even see out of the polytunnel, to be honest. They're just nice little snacks whilst you're working.
I'm Karen Guthrie. I'm the head gardener here at Lawson Park. Lawson Park is the garden belonging to Glasbren Arts, which leases this property. And we're on the Paddies, which is about 15 years old, and it's a productive fruit and vegetable garden at Lawson Park. So the Paddies is a series of informal terraced gardens. It's quite a steeply sloped site. It's the only part of Lawson Park that's deer fenced. And about 15 years ago, it was terraced with the help of a community of Japanese farmers with whom we were doing a cultural exchange. And they came over here in April, and they set about landscaping it in the way that you would landscape a Japanese paddy field. So they made little asymmetrical terraces, each stepping down and down and down until they got to the bottom of the paddy field. And we found that they left key trees and shrubs, and they mounded up earth to make these little embankments so that you could walk around the paddies. And so we've got 5 terraces, and they're not straight lines, they're not rectilinear as they would be if it was a European terraced garden. They're really kidney shaped, and they remind you a lot of Japanese paddy fields. And all around these little productive areas, we've left the native plants to grow. Obviously we manage it a bit so as we don't cast too much shade, but it's pretty relaxed and wild around these small cultivated areas. And we have a mixture of fruit and vegetables growing here. So Lawson Park is situated on the east of Coniston Water in the Lake District. We get well over 2 metres of rainfall a year, and we're at 200 metres elevation. Southwest facing, which is a good thing. So it's reasonably open, but it's very, very poor soil. There's really no history of farming here. It's challenging. It's a challenging place to grow fruit and vegetables. And I do it in lots of different spaces around Lawson Park. I have some more conventional fruit and veg garden as well. But this is the one that is, in a way, the most compelling, because it's so unexpected to walk into the wilderness, come through a gate and find fruit and vegetables growing really productively. And it's just a very beautiful space to be here, really. It's, you feel immersed in the landscape when you're here, and it gives a different kind of texture to the sort of gardening that you do when you're here. When I started to garden on the paddies, I was a less experienced fruit and veg gardener, and I used a lot of quite conventional approaches to try and make this ground productive. And it took me a number of years to realise that cultivating in a different way using no dig now for the last 6 years here. It's been 100% no dig. This is healthier than my more conventional raised beds where I grow veg, and this is much more fertile and easy to manage. But I find it amazing, the volume of food that comes out of this with actually relatively little input. We don't have any flat land at Lawson Park, so everything has to cope with the slope. Something that I learned when I travelled in Japan and really spent time with people growing vegetables there was how important it was to just orientate beds correctly. You keep it open, you make sure that your beds are running north to south, and gently sloping them so they're facing south so they warm up a little bit better, and of course that increases the drainage a little bit. So actually a slope can be your friend. That gentle warming up, especially at the beginning of the season, I'm finding that these beds are a couple of degrees warmer than anything that's grown on the flat. So the paddies are about 2/3 soft fruit and 1/3 veg at the moment. And the joy of the soft fruit is how little resources we have to put into them to get a great crop. We do have to protect them from the birds, but we never have to water this garden. But the key is to establish them very well. So when we add a new fruit bush or fruit tree, we keep it weed free for at least 3 years. And then over time we allow the wildflowers and the grass to sort of encroach, and we keep it managed by just light strimming. So we're pretty hands off, but the first years are really important to get that plant away and able to compete with the much more vigorous native habitat around it. You know, I'll never stop growing veg on this paddy field, and this one area, which is really not large, it's maybe 100 square metres, is extremely productive, and I love to experiment with new crops here that I'll then adapt and use in other gardens. And so this is my trial area, and I'm collecting seed from some of the plants that I've grown over years here. To have some seed that is really well adapted to these kinds of conditions would be, to me, really valuable, and I can share it with my neighbours as well. And it's just a joy really to see what is self-seeding around here and thriving and adapting techniques over time. Yeah, so I'm, like all good gardeners, obsessed with compost. And I make a huge amount at this point in the summer. Midsummer for me is the peak time because you've got all the long days and you've got heat and you've got lush growth and you can make a giant pile very fast. Because we do no dig here, we need a lot of compost, we need a volume of it. So regularly at this time of year, I, and anyone I can find to help, go around pulling up the bracken, which is really one of the most kind of persistent problems in this kind of land, is keeping the bracken at bay. But it's your friend at this time of year, because it decomposes really fast in a compost heap. So we will take in, you know, a 2-storey house-size pile of it across a couple of weeks and put it across maybe 8 different compost bins. And it's a good mix. You can mix it in with some grass clippings, your veg from the kitchen. A few years ago, overnight almost, we lost the whole blueberry harvest, and we realised that we had a very healthy bird population here. So we have had to build fruit cages around our soft fruit to stop that predation, because we're seeing it. But I've seen hares in this garden, I've seen pine martens in this garden. There's snakes, grass snakes everywhere, some of them really quite sizable. They're not things that are problematic in the veg garden or in the fruit, so I'm very happy to have them around, and it's part of the balance of this garden. And again, it's probably why this part of the garden is more productive than other parts of the vegetable garden. At this altitude, with a short growing season, you do have to give the plants an absolute running start. So all you can do to make this environment incredibly intensively productive is welcome. And I think one of the problems, the challenges of this space, is that the trees are doing you a lot of benefit. They're bringing in birds, predating on aphids. They're helping shelter the fruit and veg, but they also can cast a bit of shade. So every winter we do a bit of editing of the trees and the hedgerows, and we just make sure they're not getting too tall and too shady, but they are still able to give us shelter. And that's a really key part of what's succeeding here, is we have a bit of shelter from the wind. In this kind of garden, it's really important to fill up the empty ground as it becomes available, and just don't leave space that you've mulched and weeded. Don't leave it empty for a couple of months, because the humidity here and the fertility is so high that, you know, if anything sits still for more than a day here, it will grow something on it, moss or grass seed. We had a number plate on the back of the pickup that had a garden growing on the top of it, because it's just so moist here and fertile that everything will grow something on it. So for me, it's not an option just to leave a piece of ground empty, because it will weed up quickly. Something like this, it's not, I mean, this is a bit, I can see that it's not massively relatable, because a lot of people don't have this amount of land, but this shows you that you don't need to give up on very, very thin soil. You know, there's no soil here. And so all this soil has been made by us through mulching. There's nothing more complicated than that. And you can do it. You can make extremely fertile soil that way. And it's incredibly reassuring. You know, you don't have to go and buy 20 tons of topsoil. Just make it.
Hi there, I'm Maddie Harland and I'm one of the founders of Permaculture magazine. It's an international publication about all things sustainable and green and low impact. And I'm sitting in my no-dig vegetable garden, which is really near the house. So in permaculture design terms, it's zone 1. So we started this vegetable garden a long time ago, about 25 years ago, when we first got the garden extension. Where I'm sitting was an arable field. It had no soil life whatsoever, and so our first thought was we want to restore this as a biodiverse wildlife habitat. But then we discovered permaculture and we really got the link between healthy food and growing it at home and minimising our ecological impact in the world and creating conservation and wildlife habitats. So we do love our companion planting. In a way, the whole garden is the companion to the vegetable patch. There isn't a sort of separation of this is our ornamental garden or this is our wildlife garden and these are our veggies. We like to blend and have as much edge as possible. And the reasons for this is because we want wildlife in the garden, not only for the pleasure but also for the predator-pest control balance. But one of the really simple things that you can do is just grow pot marigold at the edge of a bed to bring in beneficial insects. And this all started with just a few seeds a few years ago. They go to seed and then they'll seed. We transplant them to places where we want them, usually on the edges. They add colour and they're just a really good companion plant for veggies. So the idea of this garden was always that it would be no dig, that we would always use a lot of mulch to not have bare soil, cover the soil as much as we could, to mimic natural principles, and to grow completely organic, fresh veg for as much of the year as we possibly can. So this is our overhanging bean structure. The great thing about it is the beans hang down, so you don't have to search for them, and it means that you pick every bean that's available so that the plant keeps growing as long as the season lasts. And it also has another advantage that underneath it you can grow things like salads that in the height of summer tend to bolt. So once these beans are up and over this arch, it will cast more shade, and that will hopefully prevent some of the difficulties with bolting crops. We do tend to grow in rows. It just makes it much easier to hand hoe. And we do use our own garden compost. So I'm looking at the bed in front of me just here, and I can see that I've got some volunteer tomato seedlings from last year, which, you know, would not grow true, but they're easy enough to hoe out between the leeks. So one of the themes of this garden is thinking about how you can not only grow crops on the horizontal, so here I would say that these courgettes are horizontal, but also what can I fit in on the vertical to create structure and interest and contrast in the garden. So here this little guild is a mixture of some self-seeded flowers at the front, poppy and marigold once again, 2 different types of courgette, and then a couple of very large sunflowers which we'll really enjoy when they come into full flower in a few weeks. To be quite honest, now in year 25 or so of this garden, we have very, very few slugs because we have a lot of slow worms and birds. We have thrushes in the garden that eat the snail, and we also have toads and frogs that love the habitat of the wildflower meadow and the long grasses. It wasn't like this at the beginning, that we were plagued with slugs until we got our ponds and our habitats established. So this is how we like to grow our squashes. In this bed for the whole of spring until about 2 weeks ago were broad beans, and we've cropped the broad beans, taken them out, but at the same time we start off squash plants as the broad beans are maturing. So the idea of this bed is to stack in space and time. So to stack by having a vertical crop starting off while we've got a horizontal crop, and also then to mix 2 crops, so when one matures the other one takes over and will festoon this bamboo with hanging squash, and it's really delicious. In the sense of utter pragmatism, if I was going to design this garden for maximum yield, I would have rectangular beds, because rectangular beds are much easier to net from cabbage whites and to protect against frost with fleece and all those very sensible practical things. But when we started this garden, we actually were given these railway sleepers, which incidentally we have lined with a heavy duty plastic, because the railway sleepers can leach tar into beds, which is carcinogenic. And at that time, the easiest way to lay them out was to not cut them, so to lay them out in triangles. And we were also, because this is right next to our patio and house, we wanted to make a sort of potager garden that had flowers as well as vegetables, and we were looking to make it look as attractive and beautiful as we could. Hence the comfrey hedge that you'll see around it, because we wanted to give it a boundary that was also really practical. So the comfrey hedge is there, it brings in lots and lots of gorgeous bumblebees, particularly in its first flowering in the spring. It delineates this part of the garden, and then we cut it and compost it or use it as a fresh comfrey mulch on the beds in between crops. So this is just a small greenhouse, it's 8 by 6 foot, so it's just a little domestic greenhouse, and we like to grow as much as we can in it. So at the back is a peach tree which is wonderfully productive. Tim prunes it so it's espaliered, and it's actually not on a rootstock. So it's an own root peach, and the original peach stones come from an eco-village near Berlin called Zeg Eco-Village, and were given to me by Achim, a permaculturist and gardener, and he'd selected the best peaches from stone and grew them all around the eco-village, and he gave me a bag full, and I brought it home and propagated some, and this is one of our most successful peach trees. It fruits gorgeous, luscious, large peaches every year, and it's really delicious. you can't grow a healthy garden without really wonderful soil, and the way to get wonderful soil is not to buy it in a bag, but make it yourself. So compost everything. There's loads of information out there on composting. We compost absolutely everything we can in this house, so kitchen waste, all of our weeds, any trimmings from the garden, and then we also shred all our paper in the office, and we also use cardboard layers in the compost bins. And tiger worms love cardboard and munch it up quickly, and it sort of creates a breeding habitat. So we make a lot of compost, and we turn it too. We don't just make a thing of compost and leave it. We turn it at least once, and that hugely speeds up the process and makes much healthier compost. So if you want to find out more about permaculture, we publish a permaculture magazine, which is quarterly, and that's available all over the world. It's in print, but we also have a digital edition that you can find out more about at our website. We've published over 100 books on permaculture and other related subjects, and there are e-book versions of those. But we also like to do the gift economy, so we've got a whole collection of free e-books, some introductory, some in more detail, and they're all available on our website as well.
Hi, my name's Josh. I'm the head gardener here at Birch Farm in Wolseley in North Devon. And here we are standing in one of our kind of brand new syntropic food forests. What we're trying to do here is develop a syntropic food forest system that fits with annual growing especially. And so what we want to actually do is, this whole field is about 1.5 acres, and we're splitting this into 5 sections of different food forests, and we want to then add it into a coppice rotation. And so where we're standing now is the first one. And the first one we know is going to have a lot of sunlight because there's not a lot of trees. And so we've got loads of like outdoor tomatoes, courgettes, squash, we've got some herbs, leeks, drying beans, all sorts of sun-loving crops in here. And then as these tree canopies begin to develop, like here, and shade begins to form, then we'll swap over to more protected crops like lettuce. The shade will stop the lettuces from bolting and stop them going a bit bitter. And then as that shade develops even more and more and we can't grow crops anymore, we'll then cut the whole thing down, build a hugel bed like you can see here. So all the logs and wood from the cut down trees will be buried under the ground, and then we'll restart the whole thing again. So brand new trees, brand new herbs, back to sun-loving crops like beans and tomatoes, and then that will be the rotation around the field every so often. And what's exciting about that is that we basically have a forest system in our produce field that's building fertility for us. So that fertility means we don't have to buy any compost in, we don't have to add any fertilizers or anything like that, because all the logs we're burying and the trees themselves are building all the fertility for us. And because it's a coppice rotation, we can let it get as big as we want, and then once we're ready we can cut the whole thing down and start again. A big component of the farm, because what we're trying to do here is create a form of natural farming inspired by Japan, and a big part of that is diversity. Like us, a community is where we're far more suited, so we like diversity as a species, and so do plants and ecosystems. And so a big thing about the farm is polyculture. And polyculture is a way of us growing multiple different plant families in one space to create diversity, which then creates far better habitat for things like predators, and helps with fertility problems or anything like that. So here you can see the beds look like a big jumble, but it's all by design. And so here we have a chicory, which we can pick the young leaves for salad, calendula for pollination, tomatoes, which we're breeding outside to breed an outdoor tomato. And then we have lettuces here that are starting to go to bolt for us to collect seed. But also in amongst that we have chickweed, which is a really good edible weed. We have dock, plantain, Persicaria affinis, which we can use as a grain substitute. And all these different plants together creating that fertility and habitat to bring a whole host of insects, both pest and predator, that will basically self-regulate themselves. So we have to do minimal input on that part of the farm. Here on the syntropic side, we have a Glebinotis, which is a chrysanthemum, beautiful, delicious, crunchy, textured stems. a poplar, a mashua, borage, strawberry, lemon balm, dandelion, chickweed, chives, marjoram. So even in this space here, we've got about 10 to 15 different plant families or genus and species, which are all helping each other and regulating the system. Part of that polyculture for us is making sure that every single bed has an aromatic herb in it or an aromatic plant. The reason for that is just from experience and observation here that aromatic plants seem to attract a lot more beneficial insects, and especially things like predatory wasps or flies that are really good pest controllers. And so every bed we try to get some kind of aromatic in. So in this bed here, you can see we've added dill, which is now going to seed. So we pick the dill during its leafy stage and then we allow it to flower, which is bringing huge pollination in. And I can almost smell it in the air now I'm standing here. And then this bed in general is actually quite exciting because what natural farming teaches us is that we have to try to collect as much seed from our space as possible, because by collecting seed we're breeding stronger and more resilient crops to our land. And so here this is all perpetual spinach that we're allowing go to seed now. We'll collect that seed and that will be our crop for next year, and then allowing the dill to go to seed with that just works in partnership with that. So when I first started the farm, I was a big believer in cover crops. I had just studied in America looking at regenerative agriculture, where cover crops are almost used as much as we use compost here. But realising the use of the cover crops, especially where they were coming from, like Scotland, Slovenia, halfway around the world almost, it kind of made me challenge my ideas of cover crops. And natural farming especially is about building fertility from what you have on the land. And the best thing that we can use for that is weeds. And so now what we've done is develop a system here where we actually grow our weeds and crops together as one. And those weeds can be edible as well, so we can forage those weeds like dandelion and stinger nettle. So they still have a really important edible element on the farm. But what we're finding is that year on year, by us manicuring the crops to a point that the weeds don't get ahead, we're just building fertility massively. We've never had a fertility problem. We don't use compost, we don't use fertilizer, we don't use anything like that. And I think what it is down to is the fact that the polyculture and the weeds creating such a diverse root system in the ground, and then a lot of them being perennial as well, we're just building fertility. And then what the weeds can also be is free mulch for the ground. So when we think the weed is getting a little bit too much, or we feel that the ground is drying up, all we have to do is sickle the weeds down, drop them on the ground, use them as mulch, and they'll retain all the moisture and again help build fertility on the ground. So this is a really good example of one of our new syntropic grows. So syntropic agriculture is the use of trees like any agroforestry, but we're planting them in a really dense format. And that density, like here, like the willow right next to the apple, which also has a poplar right next to it, that diversity and competition will allow the apple to grow even bigger because it's trying to outcompete the two crops. And then what we do is we come through as growers and we prune the willow and poplar to make sure it doesn't become too dominant. Now there's an idea that that pruning will cause the willow to send a reaction down to the ground. It's been pruned by an animal, it needs to put growth on to survive. And we reckon that actually by putting those chemicals into the ground, the apple will also pick that up and equally have that growth as well. And by creating that complexity and competition and biodiversity, you just end up with a lot bigger, stronger agroforestry for it, because they're fighting each other. It's like a giant Thunderdome that they're trying to beat each other in. But as the grows, we are very much coming in and editing it. And all the cuttings that we take from the willow and the poplar, we drop on the ground, and then that will build fertility. So we don't have to use compost again. We're always building fertility. And then below that, there's a mass kind of polyculture and diversity like you find in nature, like you find in the wild. We have perpetual spinach, sweet Sicily, we have a grapevine climbing up the poplar. Once the poplar gets nice and high, the grapevine will go right to the top and we'll be harvesting grapes off it. We have nasturtium, oregano, that's the aromatic herb again in the system. Comfrey as a biomass. So while our willows and poplars are quite young, we use comfrey to chop every so often and drop as a mulch on the ground, again to build fertility. We have loganberry, we have alpine strawberries that stop the weeds creeping in, and the alpine strawberries create a really beautiful weed suppressant on the mat. So even though we want a certain amount of weeds, we don't want things like grass taking over, so the strawberries are really good at stopping that. So as you can see, it's a really complex, diverse system that is also part of a business, and we factor that in. So even though it looks quite complicated and mixed, it's really good at generating those crops that we need to sell to kitchens or shops or restaurants, so that we can generate an income as well. So we are part of a collective. We're called the Collective at Wolseley, which is the company that the farm is part of. And so we very much grow for a pub called the Farmer's Arms in the village of Wolseley in North Devon. And that also includes a fish and chip shop and a village shop that we grow for. And so everything on the farm is catered towards the chefs to make sure that they can produce the most brilliant and tasting and innovative food as possible. So we can introduce new different plants such as perennials, fruits, give it to them, and they'll turn it into something delicious to really push their menu. And that is a big factor of the farm, and that's what we're here to grow for. And although a lot of this can look like a giant mess, it's very weedy, it's very crazy and wild, the polycultures make everything quite confusing. It is a really efficient system that we've developed here. It works really well for us. Our inputs are really low. We're not buying in compost, we're not buying in fleece or netting or protections. And so we can just let the system grow, and we rely a lot on the ecosystem to protect us from kind of like pest problems. So even though we allow the slug to live here, we encourage the slug almost, we don't want like an overpopulation of it. What we want is lots of beetles to come in and gobble them up. And so we use a lot of this to build habitat. So the farm layout as it is now, all the polycultures is good for building fertility, but a lot of it is also about generating pollination and building habitat so that the ecosystem looks after itself. And natural farming in its essence is growing food within an ecosystem that caters and self-regulates, that we don't have to start to feel that we have to get involved and add this chemical or add this spray or do that. We just want the whole thing to tick along. And from what we've experimented with 4 years now, it's working wonderfully. This has been our best year. I think we've had about 95% crop survival, and we haven't had to do anything to impact the field or the ecosystem. And in fact, what we're finding is we're just generating huge amounts of biodiversity. New bees, new birds, new insects are coming in daily that we're discovering, and that we're discovering have really positive outlooks on the ecosystem. Much like the Syntropic, we're also finding that annuals really like the competition. That little bit of competition really helps with plant growth, and I think that's across all plant growth. Plants and nature itself is quite a rugged animal. You know, it likes to fight, it likes to push its boundaries a little bit, and definitely with the crops they definitely like that. And as the grower, what we do is we just make sure that the sow thistle doesn't take control. So we'll sickle them back, drop them as a mulch, give the leek a head start. And now, like here, the sow thistle is flowering at a much shorter height, but it's growing in perfect balance with the leek. And here we have meliotus, the sweet clover that's seeded in. We had carrots here that we've cut the tops and chopped and dropped. Down here, we've got a dock right here. The dock plays host to all our dock beetle. By the dock beetle eating the dock means it doesn't eat our rhubarb, so we keep our rhubarb secure because they'll rather eat the dock. And that dock root is probably going a metre in the ground, bringing up minerals from the mineral layer and also helping cultivate the soil. And as you can see, it's just growing in a beautiful harmony. We have wood nightshade here, growing with leeks, Phacelia that's self-seeded in. We have the black mint, the agastache. These are self-seeded kales, so we know that these kales are really good against pest pressure, and so we'll probably collect a lot of seeds off these next year because we know they're really strong. And you can just see it's growing in a beautiful equilibrium amongst each other, and there's just no need to weed it, there's no need to mulch it, there's no need to have this kind of idea of perfection that we have that is neat, sterile and tidy. And by allowing it to be quite weedy and messy and rugged, you're also building huge amounts of habitat. If I clear all this kind of chop and drop mulch from under here and I dig the soil a bit, I can already see worms, beetles, earwigs, all these different creatures that are part of that ecosystem that are really important for controlling pests and building fertility on the farm.
About 6 years ago, I was working for a professional rugby club, and it became increasingly obvious that I was getting quite unwell, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I didn't feel right. By the time that contract ended, I was actually so ill. There was no way I was going to be able to find another job. I needed to go to the doctors and say, what's going on? I walked into the doctors and said, look, I've put on all this weight, I don't feel very well. I'm happy for you to tell me I've got a severe case of cake, but I think my thyroid's gone. So a few tests later, and they confirmed that my thyroid was misfunctioning, dysfunctioning, whatever, and also that I was desperately low in vitamins and minerals in my body. And I actually was at the point where I felt so ill, I just went to bed. Basically, I was in bed for about 23 hours a day for about 4.5 months. And Mr. and Jay and I were also in the process of trying to find a new place to live. So we were in a rented house that we'd rented together just to see whether we could stand living together or not. And we agreed to live together for 6 months and see how that worked. And 2.5 years later, we thought, well, perhaps we'll buy somewhere together. So during that time of feeling so ill and so awful, we saw this place advertised and we came to see it and completely fell in love with it. And I walked around here using walking sticks to get me around and wondered whether it was something that I could take on, whether actually I was just being mad, thinking that I could take on something that was a bit over 3/4 of an acre when I could hardly walk around the house, let alone around the garden. But, you know, belief and faith in that you can do things goes an awfully long way. And so we went through the process of buying this, and all the time I was still getting more and more poorly. And probably about 3 weeks before we bought it, I seemed to turn a corner and my health started picking up very slightly. And we started our new life here in a pretty precarious situation of what do we do if I don't get any better than I am now? And I think both of us just believed that, you know, that I having turned that corner and very slightly started getting better, that living here would improve my health exponentially. One of the key things of our relationship is that when we got together, we agreed we would divide everything 50-50. So all our bills are split down the middle, even our food bills. Being that poorly, I knew I wasn't going to be going back to work in the same kind of work that I've done before, which has always been fairly stressful, at peculiar hours, and I knew that I was going to have to be kinder to me. So I said, why don't I commit to producing our food as my equivalent to putting in cash. So rather than having to go out to work and have 2 cars and pay for clothes to work in and all of those things to earn this bit of money to buy food, why don't I grow the food? So Mr. J was really happy about that, and I think we both kind of understood that that wasn't going to be an instant fix. I wasn't going to be instantly putting money into our joint account, but that over time that would come. It would come in terms of we would be paying out less on food, and maybe eventually down the line I'd find a way of creating an income from this site as well. I think I had really unrealistic expectations of how much I could achieve. I was thinking of how much I would have achieved before I got ill in any given day, and I just wasn't factoring in that now everything was going to be much slower to develop and for me to be able to do things. So I kind of thought, how it will take me a couple of months to create this raised bed garden, but actually you've got to get from A to B and the process of building that vegetable garden was much longer, and yet it was better. The fact that it took so long meant that we actually had time to learn much more, that the wind doesn't just come from one direction. There are different times of year that it comes from another direction. So I couldn't just say, well, I'll put a windbreak here, because actually I needed one on that side as well for the few weeks a year that the wind came from that side. And the plan on paper started to unfold, but as that process happened, we were able to build in all the other things that we were learning through through observation and through experience. So it's 5 years since I first went out into that field and looked around it, and I now produce all the fruit and veg for our family, apart from the odd thing that we can't grow here. But I'm not just growing for our family. I've now been running a CSA, a community supported agriculture veg box scheme for the last 2 years. I trialled it last year with an absolutely micro scheme of 7 veg boxes, and this year I'm doing 20 boxes, and that's for a 20-week season. So it's not all year round, but for 20 weeks a year, we're feeding 20 other families too. Working outside in the garden all day long could potentially be a really lonely life, and I am alone a lot of the day, or alone in terms of other human company a lot of the day. But it's far from lonely. I think there's a big distinction between the two, and in terms of being alone, it's quite easy to network. Social media nowadays allows us to do that really easily. But I actually quite like being alone. I quite like being alone with my own thoughts, or just having a bit of music playing on in the background. But actually spending time with myself and having that room to think and to breathe, and not to have a multitude of messages being thrown at me all the time from every which way media, I think is really healthy. And I'm not lonely, in as much as I think loneliness is a different state of mind, and I think being alone is where I want to be a lot of the time. And the cat's always around. There are other living things. So Monty the cat is around, the ducks, the chickens are all around. So I'm aware that there's other living beings around. And then at a much smaller level, there's a constant chatter of birds and insects, and being able to lose myself and lose my thoughts in watching those is such a privilege, and it's such a joy that I don't actually have time to be lonely. I'd never have imagined 5 years ago when we were first looking around here that I would then be writing a book about our experience. And it's less about my experience or Mr. J's experience here than a biography of the field, of the transformation from just a paddock to this living, breathing, food-producing space. And it's been such a short journey, and yet it's been a really exciting one. And there are some days it's felt like it's been a very long journey, but overall that process has been really interesting, and it's been exciting, and I'm really pleased to have a chance to share just how we've done that, the process I've gone through, the thinking behind it, and I've included lots of why I chose to do one thing rather than another, and I share my mistakes and my successes, and there's just a lot of celebration in it of the changes that have happened to that field that looked like just grass when we moved in, and it had alpacas and a pony on it, and it was a paddock for animals, and to be able to see it now looking so different and having such a hugely different function, it feels like a privilege to be able to share that, and to be able to take you along with me on that journey to where it is now. There's quite a stark contrast between what's happening here and what's happening on the other side of the hedges around us, where we are surrounded by industrial agriculture with the monoculture crops, and I'm very aware of it because I see the farmers out there with their combine harvesters and their sprays and notions and potions doing whatever it is that they need to do, produce massive amounts of food. But it's all one thing, and with it there are all the issues that come with industrialised agriculture. And I wish there were more small producers. I wish just on a local level there were more people producing small amounts of food. You know, 3/4 of an acre is not. It's a large garden, and I'm not going to dismiss that in terms of just being a garden, it's a huge space. But in terms of food production, it's a really small space, and yet the diversity of food that we can produce for the number of families that we can produce it without using artificial chemicals. It's just a huge difference, and I wish there were a lot more smaller producers. Members of our VegBot scheme are also thrilled at knowing exactly where their food came from, and they all say how much nicer it tastes. Now, whether it actually tastes nicer or not, I'm not going to argue that one, but if it's perceived to, and I think there's a lot about knowing where your food came from that then satisfies other needs in your brain about this is good for me, and if you feel like you're doing something that's good for you, you feel better in that cyclical way. So each year I have developed a new area, so I've created an area and I've got comfortable with the food production in that area, and then moved on to another project the next year. And part of that is because I wanted to complete that area how I imagined it would be. It's nothing like I imagined it would be at the beginning. It's way better, which is lovely. I'm really pleased about that. But there's a part of me that constantly wants to learn and change and develop and see how much I can push the boundaries or not. So that area has been evolving, and I kind of feel like it's complete in terms of its structural development now. And the next set of changes are about how much more efficiently I can use that space. So my next set of expansion, to some extent, is less about expanding the area and more about concentrating on particular areas and expanding what I'm growing in them. Because I think the time will come when there isn't any room to physically expand, but emotionally, mentally, that's an ongoing journey.
I'm Dan.
And I'm Laurie, and this is Freedom Forest, which is our 3 acres of land in the southeast of England. And our mission here is to grow as much of our own food as we can.
We came across this land after I had been away travelling and experienced many beautiful places in the world, and I realised one of the most important things was to people around the world is having land, and so a connection to the land was very important to me. So I used to go out walking on the footpaths with an Ordnance Survey map. I was actually doing some training for a mountain leader qualification at the time, and down a little out the way footpath I came across a bit of overgrown land with a sign with a telephone number on, and the rest is history really.
So me and Dan met when I applied for a gardening job, and Dan was actually the head gardener and employed me.
I already had the land for 2 or 3 years, and I'd been already at that stage beginning to create my dream version of paradise.
And where Dan had a huge passion for staying in the jungle, the only area that he had created here really when I came along was he had begun to plant his own jungle here in the UK, and you were trying to grow a few crops like potatoes and things like that, but it wasn't going very well because we have a bit of a nemesis of sheep sorrel here, and it would take over absolutely everything. Because I had a huge passion for growing food and cooking, that then we looked into different methods of how we could start utilising the land to grow a lot more food. I had actually been living in New Zealand for 7 years, and then I moved back to the UK, and that was why I was applying for work in the UK again. And my journey in New Zealand had been really eye-opening actually. That's where I first learned about permaculture. I was living in this really cool town and there was quite a lot of people that were practicing permaculture, and there was a place that ran permaculture courses locally, and so it was just quite a big thing there. And I was really lucky to have some close friends who were really into permaculture, so that was kind of my initial introduction to permaculture. I actually worked with a lady who had an amazing permaculture garden, and I used to work from her house. So at lunchtime I used to go out and just pick stuff from her garden to make salads and things like that up for lunch. And I remember being really fascinated when she would tell me the story about how they planted all the fruit trees on the land before they even started building the house. And that to me at the time seemed really foreign, because it just would always feel like you should be focusing on your house first. The ethics of permaculture that I've learned since place more importance on growing food and establishing all your trees, and it really makes sense now. I've got my head around it as well, because all your fruit trees need so much time to establish, so actually by the time you've moved in, then you can reap the benefits of your garden just exactly when you need it. So that was a really lovely introduction for me, and whilst I was creating my own veg patch and really getting into growing more and more food, I was then learning about permaculture at the same time, and so I was kind of changing from conventional gardening and starting to introduce companion planting and things like that. So it was quite difficult when I left my house in New Zealand and left my veg patch and the orchard that I had started behind. But then I was lucky enough to come across Freedom Forest and Dan.
After I actually left my job and my career, which I had worked really hard to achieve, to go and stay with some of the last remote tribes around the world and experience their life firsthand, and just how they can live in a sustainable way in the landscape without destroying it. And that really began my journey of being interested in living a life closer to nature and sustainable farming as well. A few of the core things, I guess, that I could take away from my experience staying with the tribes is that, first of all, their connection to the land and the fact that they're very happy to still live a more simple way of life, and many still choose to live a simple way of life even though they could adopt many more modern things, which would mean using a lot more resources. This land was sat here for decades and no one had seen any potential in it because it was a north-facing slope and just covered in bramble and stuff, so it wasn't seen as really suitable for agriculture or anything really. But it had an acre of native woodland, which was my main interest because I love the forest, and all I was actually looking for at that time was a bit of forest where I could go to and do bushcraft and have fires without worrying about someone ringing the council that I'm having a fire and someone turning up. So that was a beautiful thing for me, and I didn't realise the beauty of having some of the more open areas as well. Initially I was just going to plant the entire thing as forest, and as time progressed and I met Laurie, we decided that starting to grow some food in the more open areas would be a really good idea as well.
And that literally just progressed one bed at a time. Because the growing conditions weren't great here, mainly due to the sheep sorrel, we had to think outside of the box for how we could make the land usable. And that's when we first came across the back to Eden methods of gardening, which then followed into no dig. And then we started bringing in more of the aspects of permaculture as well.
So back to Eden, we came across a video of a guy in America years ago, and he was struggling to grow small annual plants, yet he was seeing these ginormous trees thriving, 50, 60 metres tall, with no care for them whatsoever. And he wandered in and really looked deeper into it and just bent down and took a handful of the soil and just saw how rich and beautiful it was, and these were only getting watered from the rain. So he realised and wanted to kind of explore using a forest floor type soil on top of the ground to try and recreate some of the ways that you can grow such amazing big trees.
So Paul Gauci was the name of the guy who I think pretty much invented Back to Eden, and how he had replicated the method of the forest floor was by using mainly wood chips. And we are really lucky here that we actually have a greenway site quite nearby, and So we started bringing in as many wood chips as we could. And we ended up getting some big plastic sheets over the winter and laying those out over the first beds that we created, just to break down the weed growth a little bit more. And then the next season we did our first plantings into that bed, and everything grew really well.
One of the very recent plants I've started growing, which was a complete project of passion, was trying taro in the UK. And I went around scouring to find as many different varieties as I could. And I've been narrowing it down now, and I've found a few varieties which are actually producing some really nice corms for us here in our temperate climate.
And we're growing these both undercover in the polytunnel and outdoors. And actually, I think from next year we've decided we're only going to be growing these particular varieties outside, because they're performing well enough outside that we don't need to give them the precious space of the polytunnel, which is really amazing.
I think my attitude to self-sufficiency is not to go back in time and live like a caveman and have complete lack of everything, but to embrace some of the modern things and luxuries that we have, but also trying to bring in plants and crops from around the world, which maybe aren't well known or utilised, to create a new way of being self-sufficient in a temperate climate, which hasn't been possible to our ancestors in the past.
So self-sufficiency for me has really just become a way of life that feels really natural, and to me it feels like what we should be doing and how we should be taking care of ourselves. I used to struggle a lot with mental health actually, and I couldn't understand why I had such good jobs, but I never felt complete. I always wanted to be at home tending my garden and growing food, but society had taught me that that wasn't what we were supposed to do. As my journey has unfolded here at Freedom Forest, I realise now that this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, and it just feels so human to be taking care of ourselves as much as we can. And growing food is just the most beautiful thing that you can do for yourself, and providing fresh, organic, healthy food for your body to nurture your mind and your soul, and also to share with your loved ones is just, I think that that's the best gift that you can give yourself and anybody in your life.
And I too, like many in our society, I used to feel like I'm absolutely fine, I'm a positive thinker and I'm great, there's nothing wrong with me. But becoming more connected with nature and being around the plants all the time helped me to start beginning to realise that how much trauma, even just growing up in our society, can inflict on you, and you don't even realise sometimes. And it's been a great learning journey over the last few years to me to go inward with the support of plants and plant medicines, to begin to bring that out and realise that feeling from the heart and the gut is something that's becoming more and more present for me on a daily basis.
And that's definitely what I've connected to on this journey as well, is realising that this feels right in my gut and in my heart. What we're doing now feels like exactly what we are supposed to be doing. So we have a YouTube channel called Freedom Forest Life, and we begun the YouTube channel around the time when COVID hit in 2020, and it was partially inspired by what was happening and changing in the world, but we prior to that had a desire to just share the joys of nature with as many people as possible. And certainly for me, one of my main reasons for doing YouTube videos is to help encourage more people to just grow beautiful fresh food and enjoy good quality food for themselves, because it really is just such a gift. And when you've experienced the freshness and the taste of homegrown food, there honestly is nothing quite like that. And I just feel that everybody should have that experience in their life.
So sometimes in life it can feel like everything's beating you down and life is so hard, and I've had many times where I've just felt at the bottom and like, what's the point? And I would just love for someone else maybe to hear who's feeling like that, that anything is possible. If you can dream it and have the vision and stick to that and don't give up, then pretty much anything is possible I've found in my life. A lot of the time it's not easy. That doesn't mean to say it's going to be easy. It might take 5-10 years. I'd worked in a job for quite a few years. I really wasn't enjoying to save the money to make it possible to find this place.
It may be that you need to think up different methods and think outside of the box for how you can do things, but there is always a way to create a different life for yourself, we feel. And we do feel truly blessed to be able to live this life and have the experience with the food and nature and connection that we have here. And we also feel that anybody can do it as well.
If you want to create a thriving garden that works with nature rather than against it, then you're going to love my new book, The Permaculture Garden. So if you want to support this channel and all of these videos that I go out and make and film, then this is a lovely way to do it, and I really appreciate it. And you can also check out our other compilation video just here.